Picture this, it's late evening in Tenochtitlan, and the whole place looks like someone turned real life into a soft, glowing painting. The air is warm, but not too warm, just that perfect sit outside and vibe type of weather. The sun has dipped low behind the rim of the distant mountains, leaving the sky painted in gold, purple, and a little bit of that cotton candy pink everyone secretly loves, even if they pretend not to, down below. The great city wakes up for the evening. And yeah, I said, wakes up. Because while most cities slow down at night, Tenochtitlan kind of did the opposite. Torches and clay lamps start flickering on inside homes, along the walkways, and across the long wooden causeways that stretch like arms across the lake. Their reflections shimmer on the black water, making the whole place look like it's floating in stars. If you were standing on one of those causeways, you'd probably just stop and stare for a minute, not because you're lost, but because the view is ridiculous. Like, why does this place look better than anything my phone wallpaper has ever seen? Anyway, before we go deeper, let's zoom out for a second. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a city. It was the city, the center of a whole empire, the home of nobles, farmers, poets, warriors, teachers, merchants, artists, priests, everyone. Imagine a giant puzzle made of islands, canals, gardens, homes, temples, palaces, markets, and bridges. And now imagine all of it sitting right in the middle of a lake, sparkling under the fading light evening. Yeah, They did all that without cranes, electricity, or Google Maps. Wild. As the sky fades from gold to deep blue, the floating gardens, the famous chinampas get quiet. Earlier, people were picking vegetables and flowers there, but now the gardeners paddle back home on their canoes, gently slicing through the water. You'd hear the soft splash of paddles, the rustling of plants settling after a long day, maybe a frog or two trying to sing like they're auditioning for something important. Back in the city center, the big temples stand tall like dark silhouettes against the sky. They look serious, but also kind of peaceful at this hour. No crowds, no ceremonies, just the last rays of light brushing their steps. Even the gods, you could say, are winding down for the night. But the real action, if you can call calm nighttime action, is in the markets and neighborhoods. Down one narrow street, you'd see families finishing late meals. The smell of fresh corn tortillas drifts through the air. Someone's grilling something that smells amazing, and you don't know what it is, but you want 10 of them. Kids play little games in the street while their parents tell them to keep it down. The neighbors can hear you. You know, the usual universal parent stuff. Walk a little further and you'd run into the Tianguis, the marketplace. During the day, it's loud and busy, but at night it has a softer, sleepier energy. A few vendors hang around, chatting lazily. They talk about how good or bad sales were today. They complain about the humidity. They gossip because, let's be honest, humans have always been professionals at that. Everything is way calmer now, with just a few lamps glowing above baskets of leftover produce and pottery that didn't get sold. All around the city, musicians start to appear. A flute here, a drum there, maybe someone singing in the distance. Nothing loud. More like gentle notes floating on the breeze. The kind of music that makes you breathe a little slower without even noticing. Near the canals, a group of friends sits on the edge of a walkway. dipping their feet in the cool water and laughing about something that probably wasn't that funny, but hey, that's friendship for you. A couple of canoes glide past, carrying people heading home after a long day. One boat has a few flowers tucked at the front. Maybe someone picked them for their partner, or maybe they just like the colors. Everything feels so normal, so steady, so comfortable. That's the whole thing about these final days. Nobody knew they were final. History always hits different when you remember that the people living through it weren't checking news updates on some empire status. Currently collapsing app. Life felt stable, even magical. Sure, they had problems, worries, chores, just like any civilization, but nothing in the air suggested that a storm was on its way. In fact, if you looked at the city from above, say you were a bird or somehow had drone powers, it would look like the very picture of confidence. Streets organized in perfect grids, canals moving calmly through neighborhoods, great plazas open and spacious, boats sliding in and out like they're part of some choreographed show, and the big templo, mayor rising proudly in the middle like the city's giant heartbeat. People were preparing for the next day. Merchants planned what they'd bring to market. Farmers talked about harvest schedules. Builders thought about new projects. Priests studied their calendars to choose the right times for future ceremonies. Everyone had plans for tomorrow, next week, next season. They were looking ahead. They were thinking about life continuing, not ending. Even Moctezuma, the emperor, was somewhere in his palace right now, probably talking with advisors or performing quiet rituals. He didn't know what kind of storm was creeping toward his world. All he knew was that the city looked beautiful tonight, glowing like a jewel in the middle of the lake. And honestly, it was beautiful. If you stood anywhere in Tenochtitlan during this evening, absolutely anywhere, you'd feel something special, a sense of pride, belonging, comfort, home. You'd see neighbors greeting each other, hear the splash of water against canal walls, smell fresh flowers drifting from the gardens, and watch the moon slowly rise above the temples. You'd have no reason at all to think that these peaceful evenings were numbered. That's the magic and the heartbreak of this story. Nobody knew the sun was setting on an entire era. Nobody knew they were living inside the last calm chapter of a civilization that had taken centuries to build. Right now, in this moment we're standing in, the city is safe. It's alive. It's glowing with light and laughter and warmth. Everything feels like it's going to last forever, but history, as always, has other plans. And soon the quiet will begin to crack. So let's drift back into Tenochtitlan. It's early morning now, the kind where the air is cool and a little misty, like the lake is still stretching and waking up. Everything is calm, totally normal, except for one thing. The Aztecs had a habit of seeing deeper meaning in everything. And I mean everything. If a bird landed in the wrong place. Sign. If the wind made a weird sound while you were walking home, sign. If someone dropped their tortilla on the ground. Okay, maybe not that one, but honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if someone somewhere tried to interpret it. You got to understand, this wasn't superstition for them. This was their whole worldview. The universe was alive, talking, reacting, sending messages like, hey, pay attention down there. And honestly, when you're living in a world full of gods, spirits, and cosmic cycles. Who's going to argue if the sky suddenly flashes or a comet appears? You're not thinking science. You're thinking, oh, no, the gods are trying to tell us something, and I hope it's not about me. So let's rewind a bit. Years before the strangers arrived on the shores of their land, the people of the empire had already been noticing things, little things, strange things. Things that made folks whisper to each other like, hey, do you think that means something? Probably. Or, I'm not saying it's a bad sign, but it definitely wasn't a normal Tuesday. The Aztec world worked on cycles, big ones, small ones, repeating patterns. They believed time wasn't just moving forward, it was looping, echoing, teaching. And when one cycle ended and another began, big changes usually came along with it. So naturally, when odd events started popping up, people paid attention. Picture a group of elders sitting near a temple, early morning, light settling on their cloaks. They're sipping their version of hot chocolate because, yes, the Aztecs were enjoying chocolate long before the rest of us even knew it existed. And they're talking about the latest weird thing someone reported. Maybe someone saw a strange glow in the sky, or maybe a fire flickered in a way that wasn't normal. Or maybe a priest had a dream so vivid he woke up like, all right, someone write this down because I think the universe just sent me a voicemail. The important part is this: the vibe around the city wasn't panicky or dramatic. It was more like uneasy curiosity. Like when your teacher asks to speak with you after class and they don't tell you why. You're not in trouble. Probably, hopefully. But still, your brain goes, something is up. Now, not every weird thing was taken seriously. The empire was huge, and you know how stories spread. Somebody says they saw a glowing figure by the water. Yeah. Next thing you know, by the time that story reaches the market, the glowing figure is now 10 feet tall, floating and giving a TED talk on destiny. But even with exaggeration, some signs felt a bit too pointed. Take the sky, for example. People noticed strange patterns, lights, colors, stuff that made everyone look up like, did the heavens just flicker? Nights where the moon looked different, or days where the sun looked a bit strange. Again, all calm, nothing scary, just slightly odd, like the universe changed the wallpaper and didn't tell anybody. Then there were dreams. Dreams meant a lot to them. Not like I dreamed I was late to school again. More like symbolic dreams with animals, journeys, or voices. Dreams that felt heavy. People talked about these the next morning at breakfast. Oh yeah, I dreamed I was walking through a forest and a jaguar pointed at me. What? It pointed with its paw. Bro, that's definitely a sign. But the biggest source of all these interpretations wasn't the average person, it was the priests. These folks were trained for this stuff. Their whole job was reading the universe like a giant cosmic instruction manual. Imagine someone whose full-time role is literally professional omen decoder. Sounds kind of cool, honestly. They studied calendars, stars, seasons, past cycles, sacred stories. And they started noticing that certain patterns were starting to match older predictions about big changes. Not necessarily bad changes, just major ones. But here's the thing, nobody knew what kind of change. The universe wasn't sending clear emails about it, just little nudges. Like, hey, heads up, And everyone was like, okay, heads up about what? And the universe was like, you'll see. So while all this quiet tension was building, everyday life went on, markets opened. Kids splashed water in the canals even when their parents told them to stop. People cooked their meals. Festivals happened. Music echoed through the plazas. From the outside, Tenochtitlan looked totally normal. But if you paid close attention, you'd notice tiny differences. Conversations were slightly more serious. Elders seemed a little more thoughtful. Priests spent more time with their calendars. Moctezuma especially was listening carefully. He wasn't panicking, not at all, but he was paying attention in the same way someone listens to a distant rumble and thinks, is that thunder or is that something else? He heard reports from all over the empire. He invited wise people to share what they'd seen or dreamed. He spent nights thinking, lighting incense, watching the stars, not scared, just cautious, trying to interpret the signals the world was sending. And you can't blame him. Imagine being emperor and hearing that several people saw unusual things. You'd be like, okay, I should at least check this out. But here's what makes this chapter of history kind of beautiful, even with talk of omens floating around. The city didn't lose its warmth. People still joked, still worked, and still lived their everyday lives. Humans are like that. Even when something big might be coming, we still laugh, still talk about dinner, still complain about the humidity. What the Aztecs didn't know, what nobody knew, was that these small signs were lining up with something that wasn't part of their world at all, something coming from far away across an ocean they didn't even imagine was filled with other lands. But right now, in this moment, all they have are mysterious little hints. Nothing scary, just whispers that the cycle is shifting. Life keeps going. The city stays bright. The markets stay busy. Kids still refuse to go to bed on time. And the universe keeps dropping clues like breadcrumbs. Soon, those clues will make sense. But for now, Tenochtitlan keeps glowing, calm, proud, unaware. Imagine a giant city floating on a lake, glowing softly under the evening sky. That's Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, right before everything in our story begins. And right in the middle of all that beauty, all that noise, all that power, sat one man who probably slept less than most of us. His name was Moctezuma II. And trust me, being emperor was not as fun as those gold decorations made it look. Moctezuma didn't wake up every morning stretching like, ah, yes, another day to rule millions. Nope. This guy carried anxiety like it was part of his outfit. In fact, if he had a personal tagline, it would have been something like, Litter of the Empire, Keeper of the Peace, Professional Overthinker, a quiet soul in a loud world. Moctezuma wasn't the kind of leader who charged around yelling commands. He was soft, spoken, thoughtful, and honestly kind of introverted for someone who ruled a massive empire. If you invited him to a party, he'd probably show up, say something deep about the stars, and leave early because the crowd was stressing him out. He loved rituals, quiet mornings, and talking with priests who explained the meaning of dreams. And he took all of it seriously, maybe a little too seriously. If a bird blinked weirdly, Moctezuma didn't just shrug it off. No, he'd call in 5 advisors like, okay, team, what does this mean? Most emperors liked showing their power. Moctezuma liked showing his caution, And honestly, with everything he had to handle, who could blame him? Everyone wanted something from him. For Moctezuma, every day started with people needing answers. Farmers had problems. Priests had warnings. Nobles had opinions. And foreign states, they had issues too. Imagine being the one person everyone relies on while also trying not to freak out over the strange dreams you had last night. The Pat was his life. The palace itself was huge, more like a maze of courtyards, gardens, and rooms filled with advisors. People came and went all day. And while most emperors might be like, yes, welcome, admire my giant palace, Moctezuma was more like, okay, that's a lot of footsteps. Everybody, please calm down. Deep down, he was a perfectionist. He wanted to do everything right. For him, the empire wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility he held close to his heart. The rituals that kept him steady. Moctezuma wasn't just political, he was deeply spiritual. He woke up early, took quiet moments alone, and followed rituals to clear his mind. These weren't dramatic rituals. Think of them as the ancient version of morning meditation. He'd stand on his balcony, looking over the lake as sunlight poured across the city. He'd breathe in slowly, listening to the soft sounds below, the boats on the water, the distant markets waking up. It gave him peace, even if only for a few minutes. Priests visited him daily with messages, predictions, and sometimes confusing warnings. Moctezuma listened to all of it carefully, nodding slowly, probably thinking, okay, cool. But can someone tell me how that helps me decide taxes? Still, he respected them deeply. Their words shaped many of his choices. The weight got heavy sometimes. Moctezuma didn't complain out loud. Emperors weren't really allowed to. But there were nights when he walked alone in the palace gardens just to breathe. Big trees, glowing lamps, soft wind. It helped him think. Running an empire meant he had to make decisions that kept people safe, fed, and peaceful. And honestly, that's a lot for one guy, especially when he cared so much. Sometimes when he sat on his throne, he felt the pressure pressing down on him. Not physical pressure, more like the everyone expects me to be perfect feeling. If you've ever had that moment at school where suddenly everyone is waiting for you to answer something and you're like, let me think for 3 hours. You get the idea. His advisors, a mix of calm and chaos. Moctezuma had a circle of advisors who were supposed to help him. And, well, they tried. Some were calm, wise men who spoke slowly and carefully. Others were dramatic types who walked into the room like, Your Highness! Something unbelievable just happened. And Moctezuma would sigh like, please, not today. He listened to all of them because he believed decisions should be thoughtful, not rushed. He wasn't the follow my gut instantly type. He was more, let me think about that for a week and maybe meditate on it. And honestly, in a world full of unpredictable events, his cautious style probably saved the empire more times than anyone realized. He wasn't just an emperor, he was a human. One of the things people forget about Moctezuma is that he wasn't a statue. He laughed sometimes. He had friends. He had favorite foods. He even had pets, including birds he loved watching. He cared about his family and his people. And while he looked very serious most of the time, he had a softer side he didn't show publicly because emperors were expected to be strong and composed, but inside, he worried. He felt things deeply. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a person trying his best. A mind always searching for answers. Moctezuma had this habit of thinking far ahead. He cared about the future, the signs around him, the balance of the world. In a way, he was like someone who constantly checks the weather app, even when the sky is totally clear. He believed nothing happened without reason. So he watched closely, listened carefully, and studied every small change happening in his world. Little did he know, something big, something he could have never imagined, was already on its way. But for now, in this chapter, he's still just a leader sitting quietly in his palace, trying to understand the world, trying to keep everything steady, and hoping tomorrow brings calm instead of confusion. Before the turning point, this chapter is the peaceful moment before the story shifts. Moctezuma, thoughtful and cautious, stands at the center of a thriving empire. He doesn't know the future. He doesn't sense the storm fully. He only feels the weight, heavier some days, lighter on others, and he does what he always does. He thinks, he watches, he hopes, and he carries the world on his shoulders quietly. And that's where we'll leave him for now, a leader trying to hold everything together, unaware that history is about to knock on his door. Picture this, it's early morning in the Aztec world. The lake is calm. The sun is stretching like it's waking up from a nap, and people are already moving about their day. Farmers checking their fields. Traders tightening the ropes on their canoes. Priests doing their morning routines, which probably included incense, chanting, and long, dramatic pauses. Everything feels normal, peaceful, predictable. And then the rumors start. They always start small, right? A whisper here, a strange report there. Nothing big. But in this case, those little whispers would grow into something that made the entire empire sit up straight. It all began with messengers running toward Tenochtitlan from the coast, messengers who honestly looked like they had seen something wild. And to be fair, they had. So there are some people over there. The first messenger basically showed up like, "Your Highness, okay, don't freak out, but there are these weird looking folks on giant floating things." That's how the news reached Moctezuma and his advisors, not with drama, not with thunder, but with confusion. Strange people. Floating houses on the water. Wearing shiny objects that caught the sun. The council probably exchanged looks like, all right, who gave the messenger the wrong mushrooms today. But then more messengers arrived. And they all said the same thing. The coast was buzzing. For people living near the Gulf of Mexico, it was shocking. Imagine waking up, stretching, and spotting enormous structures sitting peacefully in the water like they owned the place. Except these things weren't just floating. They had tall towers. Big white sheets catching the wind. Strange noises. And people walking on them who did not look like anyone they'd ever seen. Some locals tried to describe them. The descriptions were rough. They're pale. They have hair like straw. They carry sticks that make thunder. They wear shiny shells on their chests. By the time these descriptions traveled inland, the story was sounding less like a report and more like someone trying to explain a dream they barely remembered. But everyone agreed on one thing. Whoever these visitors were, they weren't from here. Moctezuma, the world's most stressful job, part 2, When the news reached Moctezuma, he paused. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He just paused, the kind of pause you do when your brain is saying, oh, now, what now? Remember, Moctezuma was already a cautious guy. He noticed signs everywhere, clouds, birds, fire, rainbows, everything had meaning. So hearing about strange visitors arriving from the east wasn't just news to him. It was a message. The east wasn't just a direction. In Aztec belief, it was symbolic. The place where the sun rose, where certain gods were connected, where change often came from. So yeah, this was a big deal. He called his advisors in. He listened to every messenger carefully. And after hearing the same story repeated a dozen times, he finally believed it. Something unusual had arrived. Something new. Something that didn't fit into any of his world's normal patterns. Who were these people anyway? Of course, nobody knew the answer. The Aztec world had its own network of city-states and faraway cousins, but these visitors seemed completely outside of any known maps. The clothes? Weird. The hair? Weird. The objects they carried? Also weird. The way they acted and spoke? Very weird. One messenger described how their language sounded like someone is trying to talk while also coughing and also arguing with themselves. Another said, they point a lot. Honestly, the whole thing became a guessing game at the palace. Some advisors thought they might be traders from a faraway land. Others wondered if they were spirits or something close to spirits. A few suggested keeping distance until they knew more, which honestly sounded like the most reasonable plan. And then there were the older priests who were like, interesting. This reminds me of a prophecy. And whenever elders bring up prophecy, you know the vibes immediately get heavier. The coast affront, row seat to mystery. Meanwhile, people living by the shore couldn't stop staring. You know how when something strange shows up in your neighborhood, everyone suddenly becomes local investigator. That's basically what happened. Kids were pointing and whispering. Fishermen were like, yeah, that's not a normal boat. Mothers kept their children close because, well, you never know. Merchants wondered if this meant new markets or new trouble. But one thing was clear: the strangers weren't hiding. They came ashore. They walked around. They accepted gifts. They tried to speak with locals using gestures and smiles. There were no fights, no chaos, just awkward, curious, confusing interactions. Picture a bunch of people trading hand signals like, you want food? No? Hey, okay, you want water? Still no? Okay then. What do you want? Moctezuma sends out scouts. Moctezuma's cautious nature kicked in. He didn't rush toward these visitors. He didn't send an army. He sent scouts, calm ones, smart ones, professional observers. Their job wasn't to fight or threaten. It was simple watch, learn, report. They studied how the visitors dressed, how they moved, what they carried, what they ate, how they reacted to the land. These scouts came back with more details. They ride animals, tall animals. With legs like tree trunks, they sit on them like it's normal. This part alone must have caused the entire council to sit forward. Animals, large ones, that people ride, that didn't fit into any known category. And sometimes when things don't fit, the mind starts to fill in the blanks with imagination, and imagination can get wild. The empire tries to make sense of it all in Tenochtitlan. People were buzzing with questions. Every conversation probably sounded like, "Did you hear about the visitors?" "Yeah, my cousin's friend's uncle said that they're taller than normal people. I heard they shine in the sunlight. I heard they came from the sky." "Well, my neighbor heard they eat metal, so I think people are just making things up now." No matter the rumor, everyone could feel that something was shifting, something big, something that didn't happen every day. The kind of thing that makes history take a deep breath. Moctezuma's private worries. While the city whispered, Moctezuma thought quietly, alone. He put pieces together, signs, dreams, reports, emotions he couldn't explain. And even though he didn't show fear, he definitely felt the uncertainty building. Was this a test? A warning? A new beginning? A bad omen? Or nothing at all? He didn't know. And not knowing was the hardest part for him. But one thing he did know. These visitors would change everything. He could feel it the same way you can feel a storm coming even before you see the clouds. And this is where we leave Moctezuma staring toward the east, calm but tense, waiting for the strangers to come closer, unaware of how completely his world was about to shift. The horizon was no longer quiet. Something new had arrived, and it was only the beginning. The morning the two worlds finally met didn't feel dramatic at all. The sky wasn't doing anything crazy. The wind wasn't whispering warnings. It was just a normal warm day on the coast, the kind of day where fishermen move slow and birds act like they own the place. But beneath that calm surface, something huge was quietly unfolding. Aztec scouts were making their usual rounds when they spotted shapes on the horizon. At first, they thought they were clouds, then mountains, then some kind of giant floating beasts. It took a minute before one of them said what everyone else was thinking. Those things are moving, and mountains don't move. The floating mountains were, of course, Spanish ships. But to eyes that had never seen anything like them, they looked more like something the gods would send during a dramatic plot twist. The scouts stared for so long that one of them forgot he was holding his spear. The strangers arrive. The ships came closer, drifting in with the wind until they finally stopped offshore. Then small boats came down, packed with pale, skinned men wearing shiny metal parts, basically walking mirrors under the sun, and marching beside them were horses. Now, if you've never seen a horse in your life, it's pretty understandable to assume it's some kind of giant magical creature. The scouts whispered to each other like, "Is that one animal? Or two stuck together? Why is it so tall? Why does it look like it's judging us?" The horses snorted loudly as if they were offended by the confusion. The scene felt unreal, like two different stories had accidentally crashed into the same chapter. Everyone is confused, but trying their best. The Spanish also stared at the Aztecs with the same. What on earth? Energy. The Aztecs. Bright clothing, feathers, jewelry, and calm stance made them look like royalty had just walked out of the jungle. The Spanish soldiers nudged each other like, "They look way too chill." Are they warriors? Are they leaders? Are they both? And the language problem kicked in immediately. One Spanish soldier tried greeting the scouts by waving both arms. The scouts, unsure what the gesture meant, politely waved one arm back. So yeah, communication was off to a fantastic start. The first contact is surprisingly peaceful. Despite all the confusion, nobody lifted a weapon. Nobody charged. Nobody yelled. The Aztec stepped forward slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. They carried gifts, food, water, cloth, small ornaments. In their mind, gifts were the safest and most respectful way to say, hey, we come in peace. Also, please don't attack. The Spanish responded with their own version of peaceful gifts, beads, metal trinkets, and whatever shiny objects they had handy. They didn't really know what counted as a proper offering here. So they went with the universal plan, give them something pretty and hope it works. Both sides seemed relieved when the other one smiled. This first exchange didn't feel tense or threatening. If anything, it felt like two curious groups trying hard not to look awkward. Curiosity takes over. Once it was clear that no spears or swords were coming out, curiosity started to spread on both sides. Aztec scouts took careful steps closer to the horses, but not too close. Those giant animals were still suspicious. One scout kept leaning forward like he wanted to pet one, then leaning back immediately like, nope, 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 not ready for that. Meanwhile, the Spanish studied the Aztecs' clothing, especially the feathers. Some of them whispered about how rare and expensive feathers were back home. Here, the Aztecs wore them like everyday fashion. Each side assumed the other must come from some special world. The Spanish thought, these people must be rich, powerful, maybe even rulers. The Aztecs thought, these strangers must be messengers from far away, maybe even from the gods. And both groups were wrong in some way. The horses start the first big misunderstanding. At one point, a Spanish rider guided his horse forward. The Aztecs all took a synchronized step back, not out of fear, just caution. In Aztec culture, unusual creatures were often tied to symbolic meaning. This animal was absolutely unusual. So unusual that a few scouts whispered that the rider and the horse might be one single being. Meanwhile, the Spanish were just trying not to fall off the saddle. The horse snorted again, louder this time. One Aztec scout flinched and accidentally dropped his gift basket. Everyone froze, like the horse had challenged him to a duel. The Spanish rider apologized with hand gestures. The scout apologized back with more hand gestures. The horse blinked, totally confused. This tiny moment summed up the whole encounter: friendly, but deeply confusing. Gifts lead to more confusion. When the Aztecs offered food and cloth, the Spanish accepted quickly, maybe a little too quickly. To the Aztecs, gift giving had many meanings: respect, diplomacy, and sometimes even an early step toward forming bonds. To the Spanish, it mostly meant cool, free stuff. So when the Spanish later offered shiny metal items, the Aztecs weren't sure how to read the gesture. Were these gifts warnings? A flex? One Spanish soldier accidentally handed over a small metal object he didn't mean to give, and then tried to take it back. Big mistake. The Aztec stared at him like he had just broken the gift. Laws of the universe. Eventually, the soldier panicked, waved his hands, and gave the object back again. Problem solved. Awkwardness 100%, hostility still 0%. Both sides try to talk. It doesn't go well. The Spanish tried speaking louder, as if the Aztecs just had bad hearing. The Aztecs tried speaking slower, as if the Spanish had trouble thinking. Neither strategy worked, but watching them try must have been hilarious. A Spanish soldier said something like, "We come in peace." but it sounded like a riddle to the Aztecs. One Aztec scout said something like, "What is your purpose?" But the Spanish thought he was asking for directions. At some point, both sides just started nodding. Nods became the new language. The realization settles in after hours of meeting, pointing, gifting, and confused smiling. Something finally became clear to both sides. None of this made sense. They didn't understand each other's languages. They didn't understand each other's customs. They didn't understand each other's purpose. They didn't even understand each other's clothing. The Aztecs wondered if the strangers came to trade, explore, or deliver some divine message. The Spanish wondered if the Aztecs were friendly, dangerous, wealthy, or all three. A soft tension lingered, not violent, just thoughtful. Like both sides sensed that this peaceful meeting was the first step toward something much bigger. The day ends, but the questions stay. As the sun dipped low, the Aztec messengers returned inland with stories that would shock Moctezuma. The Spanish went back to their ships buzzing with energy. Both sides felt the same strange mix inside: curiosity, caution, and a tiny spark of worry. Two worlds had touched for the first time, softly, awkwardly, peacefully, but nothing about it felt small. This day would echo far across the land. But for now, it was just humans meeting humans, both sides trying their best, and both sides realizing really don't understand each other at all. So picture this: the morning sun is warming up the sky. The air smells like wood smoke and flowers, and the canals of Tenochtitlan are calm like a giant mirror. And right at the edge of it all, a very confused group of Spanish dudes is nervously dusting off their armor, wondering what on earth they're about to walk in to. This is the moment the two worlds didn't just meet, they literally started walking side by side into one of the most amazing cities on the planet. Cortés and his men came in with this mix of excitement, fear, and please don't let us embarrass ourselves. They'd heard stories on the way: a city floating on water, temples taller than anything they'd seen since leaving home, and markets so big you could get lost just trying to buy snacks. But hearing is one thing. Seeing, that was a whole other level. As they reached the causeway leading into the city, they got their first clear look at Tenochtitlan, and honestly, they were shook. The city glowed. Some sunlight bounced off white stone buildings. Bright colors from murals and banners fluttered in the wind. Boats slid quietly across the water like they were part of the city's heartbeat. And in the middle of all this, Aztec officials stood in neat rows, waiting with calm faces like, "Yep, this is our home. No big deal." The Spanish, meanwhile, were trying their best to act cool, but inside their heads it was chaos. Imagine walking into a place so beautiful you forget what you're supposed to be doing. Even the horses seemed confused, stepping carefully, like they knew this was not a place to make noise in. Now, the Aztecs weren't just polite, they were really polite. They brought gifts. They kept a respectful distance. They guided the visitors gently, almost like they were hosting guests at a fancy hotel. It wasn't warm and buddy, but it wasn't cold either. It was more like, "Welcome, travelers. We don't know you, but we're going to treat you in the best way our traditions teach us." Cortés and his men tried to respond with the same level of politeness, though let's be honest, subtle behavior wasn't exactly their strong point. Still, They followed along, nodding a lot, smiling awkwardly, and praying their translator wasn't messing things up. As they moved deeper into the city, the streets stretched out straight and wide, lined with buildings that seemed too perfect to be real. People peeked out from doorways. Kids stared at the strange new visitors. Merchants paused mid-sale. Priests watched quietly. But the mood wasn't tense. It was more like the whole city was trying to figure out who these armored travelers were and why they walked around with such loud boots. The Spanish were equally curious. They had never seen a place where everything worked so smoothly. The canals acted like highways. The bridges lifted up. The gardens floated. Fresh water came through long stone pipes. The place had a kind of quiet genius behind it, like someone had sat down and said, "Let's build a city, but make it magical." They were guided straight toward the center, the sacred precinct, the heart of Aztec life. The closer they got, the more unreal everything seemed. Towers rose like mountains. Temples stood tall with stairways that reached toward the clouds. The sound of distant drums drifted through the air, soft but steady. Incense floated around them in little clouds, adding a sweet smell that mixed with lake air. The soldiers looked around with wide eyes. Some whispered to each other. Some held their helmets under their arms because they wanted a better view. A few probably wondered if they were dreaming. They weren't. This was all real, and it was bigger than anything they'd imagined, but here's where things get kind of surreal. Moctezuma himself came out to greet them. Yep, the emperor, the guy the whole empire looked to, the man whose word shaped the land. He didn't walk out bragging or throwing his power around. He came with calm steps, wearing clothes that basically whispered royalty. Instead of shouting it, gold glimmered softly. Feathers shimmered in the light. His attendants stood close, carrying shades to keep the sun off him. The Spanish froze. They'd never seen someone so elegant, so composed. Even Cordes, who was usually all confidence, and Bishan seemed a little breathless. Moctezuma spoke with care. His voice wasn't loud, but everyone listened. He welcomed the Spanish to his city the same way a king might welcome an unexpected storms, politely, but with a hint of, really do not know what's coming next. Cortes gave a long, respectful reply, or at least he tried. He probably tripped over a few words in his own language from sheer nerves. But everything stayed peaceful. Everything stayed calm, and that calmness was impressive, considering both sides were basically going, who are these people? Inside their heads. After the greetings, the guests were led through more streets, more plazas, and more buildings that looked like they belonged in a painting. The Spanish kept noticing things that made them whisper to each other. Did you see that garden? It's floating. Is that a zoo? They have a zoo. Wait, is that a palace? That's a palace, right? If Tenochtitlan had a slogan this day, it would be, yes, it's real. Yes, it's ours. Yes, we know it's amazing. And honestly, the Aztecs were proud, not loud. Proud, quiet, proud. The kind that comes from generations of planning, building, and caring for a city they loved. But even inside all this beauty, something else floated in the air, not fear, not anger, just uncertainty. The Aztecs didn't really know why these visitors had come so far or what they hoped to gain. And the Spanish, as impressed as they were couldn't fully understand the world they'd stepped into. Both sides were standing in the same place, looking at the same sights, breathing the same air, but seeing the world in totally different ways. Still, for this moment, the two worlds walked together. For this moment, everything felt strangely gentle. The Spanish were given a palace to stay in, a whole palace, because apparently Moctezuma didn't do anything halfway. It had wide rooms, carved walls, soft mats, and running water. The visitors settled in, still amazed, still overwhelmed, still whispering to each other as if the city might disappear if they spoke too loudly. Outside, the streets slowly returned to normal. Merchants reopened their stalls. Kids ran through the plazas again. Priests went back to their duties. The drums continued pulsing in the distance, steady and calm. But deep inside the city, behind all the quiet beauty, a tiny question had taken root on both sides. What happens now? No one knew the answer yet. Not the emperor, not Cordes, not the people watching from doorways, not the soldiers staring out from the palace windows. For now, Tenochtitlan and its guests shared the same space, the same sunlight, the same gentle rhythm of the lake. Two worlds, side by side, not clashing yet, just coexisting in a silence full of wonder. And that silence was the last moment of true calm before everything slowly started to change. For a while, everything in Tenochtitlan seemed almost peacefully strange. The Spanish were settling into their fancy borrowed palace, trying to act normal in a city that looked like a dream. The Aztecs were doing their best to treat their guests politely, even though no one truly understood what these newcomers wanted. On the surface, it all looked calm, like the smooth water of the lake on a quiet morning. But beneath that surface, tiny cracks were starting to form. Quiet ones. The kind you don't notice until you step right on them. The first tension wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't even something big. It was more like those small misunderstandings you get when you're talking to someone from a totally different world, because that's exactly what was happening. The Spanish came from a world where wealth meant gold. If something was gold or even looked like gold, their eyes sparkled like they'd found treasure in a video game. But for the Aztecs, gold wasn't money. It wasn't get rich material. It was more like a sacred metal, pretty sure, but not something people obsessed over. So when the Spanish kept pointing at gold objects, admiring them a little too much, whispering to each other a little too often, the Aztec hosts noticed. They didn't say anything. They were polite people, but they exchanged those tiny glances that basically meant, okay, what's with these guys and the yellow metal? Meanwhile, the Spanish started feeling confused about Aztec traditions. They saw ceremonies, heard music that didn't sound like anything back home, and watched priests in beautiful robes doing rituals they didn't understand. To the Aztecs, these were normal, everyday things, part of their rhythm, part of their identity. But the Spanish weren't used to it. And humans tend to be suspicious of what they don't get. So misunderstandings floated around like stubborn little clouds. Another small tension came from food. Yep, food, Aztec cuisine was amazing. Fresh tortillas, beans, chocolate drinks, fruits straight from gardens that basically grew on water. But the Spanish kept asking questions like, what is this? And is this safe? They didn't mean to be rude, but it kinda sounded like they thought the Aztecs lived on alien snacks. Still, nobody said anything. Everyone kept smiling, even though the smiles were starting to look a little forced. But the tension didn't just come from culture. There was a political layer, too, and this one was trickier. Aztec nobles were watching everything. They saw how Moctezuma treated the Spanish with extreme respect, maybe too much respect. Moctezuma was cautious by nature, thoughtful, always trying to read signs. He wanted to keep the peace. He wanted to understand the visitors before making any bold moves. But not everyone agreed with that approach. Some nobles whispered among themselves, "Why are these strangers allowed to walk around our city? Why do they stay in a palace? What if they're planning something?" Nothing explosive, just quiet murmurs. But murmurs have power when they happen inside an empire. And the Spanish, they picked up on the mood. Not clearly, but enough to feel that the warm welcome was cooling down a bit. They noticed guards standing a little closer to them. They noticed how crowds kept more distance. They noticed how Moctezuma looked slightly tired during meetings, like something heavy was pressing on his mind. Then came the tiny disagreements over rules. The Spanish were used to doing things their own way. Back home, soldiers could walk almost anywhere, ask almost any question, and inspect things freely. But here, some areas were off limits. Certain temples were sacred 4 or 5 times. Spanish men walked somewhere they weren't supposed to, not because they wanted trouble, just because they didn't know. Each time, Aztec officials politely redirected them, but their smiles were tighter every day. That's how pressure works. It doesn't need battles or shouting, just a dozen small moments piling up until you can feel it in the air. One day, a group of Spanish soldiers watched the great marketplace from a balcony. They were amazed. It was huge, organized, full of people selling everything from pottery to food to bright feathers. But the more they observed, the more they whispered about how wealthy the city seemed, how big the empire was, how strong. Those whispers didn't stay private. Aztec ears were sharp. Even though the Spanish didn't mean harm, the words landed like pebbles hitting a drum, small but noticeable. If the visitors admired the power of the city too much, did that mean they wanted a piece of it? The Aztecs couldn't tell. Over in the palace, Moctezuma walked slowly through long hallways, thinking. He cared about keeping peace. He cared about protecting his people. But as days passed, even he felt the tension rising. His advisors brought him rumors of Spanish curiosity about gold, about land, about power. Moctezuma kept calm. He kept hosting meetings, offering gifts, staying respectful. His nature didn't let him explode or show fear. But deep down, he knew things weren't balanced anymore. And Corday sensed the shift too. He wasn't a calm soul like Moctezuma. He thought faster, acted faster, worried faster. He noticed the tone of conversations changing. Even little things like the way Aztec officials paused before answering questions made him wonder if the warm welcome was slipping away. Neither side wanted conflict. Nobody woke up saying, "Yeah, let's ruin everything today." No. This was a slow motion thing, like clouds gathering before a storm you don't see yet. One afternoon, the Spanish went out for a guided walk through the city. It was peaceful. But the crowds kept a few steps farther back than before. Kids didn't come as close. Merchants didn't wave. People watched quietly, their expressions thoughtful, curious still, but guarded. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was that feeling you get when someone strange is staying in your house for too long. Inside the palace, the Spanish noticed that supplies took a bit longer to arrive. Not long enough to be rude, just long enough to make them wonder. Meetings with Moctezuma didn't happen as often. Translators took a little more time passing messages back and forth. It was like the whole city was holding its breath. That's how misunderstandings work. They're slow. They're quiet. They start as little things, side glances, hushed conversations, awkward pauses, until suddenly you look around and realize everyone is on edge without knowing exactly why. As the sun set each evening, the city still looked magical, torches flickering on water, gentle music drifting from distant homes, the smell of flowers floating through the air. But under all that beauty, the calm that once felt natural now felt delicate, like one wrong move could shake everything. Tenochtitlan was still shining, still grand, still proud. But the warmth that welcomed the visitors was fading, replaced by something softer, cooler, uncertain. Two worlds were still living side by side. But now they were beginning to drift, even if no one meant for it to happen. The cracks were tiny, almost invisible, but they were there. And soon, those cracks would change everything. So Tenochtitlan was still glowing like a jewel on the lake, and life in the city looked normal from the outside. But inside the royal palace, things took a very weird turn. The kind of turn where you look around and go, whoa, how did we even get here? Moctezuma II, the emperor, the man who literally ruled an empire, suddenly wasn't as free as his title made him sound. And it didn't happen with noise or chaos. It happened quietly, softly, almost politely. One morning, the palace felt slightly different. Spanish soldiers were standing just a little closer than usual. Their armor clinked a bit more. Their eyes followed Moctezuma more carefully. Nothing dramatic or dangerous, just odd, like they were keeping track of him the way you keep track of your phone when your battery's at 1%. Cordays had decided that Moctezuma needed to stay safe, which, let's be real, was a very creative way of saying, you're not going anywhere, my guy. But the strange part, Moctezuma didn't shout. He didn't demand anything. He didn't start a fight. He stayed calm, painfully calm, because he believed that losing control would only make things worse for everyone. And honestly, the man carried responsibility like it weighed 1,000 bricks. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted. The huge stone halls that used to feel open and grand now felt tight, like the walls had leaned in a little. The soft sound of sandals on the floor echoed more. Even the servants walked slower, as if the air itself had become heavier. Let's get one thing clear, though. Moctezuma wasn't tossed into a dungeon or anything dramatic like that. This wasn't a dark, scary prison story. There were no chains, no shouting guards, no threats carved into walls. Nothing like that. The Spanish weren't acting wild. They were acting controlled, deliberate, almost too formal. Moctezuma still lived in his own palace rooms. He still wore the soft cotton robes embroidered by the finest hands in the empire. He still ate the food he liked, still spoke with his advisors, still kept some dignity as emperor. But even with all that, one thing had silently changed day. He wasn't allowed to leave, not the city, not the palace, not even certain rooms. It was freedom, but with walls. And that kind of prison can feel even stranger. His advisors felt the shift instantly. They walked into the palace with their usual confidence, but the moment they saw Spanish soldiers standing near Moctezuma's chambers, their faces tightened. Not aggressive, tight. More like, oh, this is not good. Tight. They bowed to Moctezuma, spoke softly, asked if he needed anything. But every conversation had an invisible weight pressing on it. Every pause felt deeper. Every whisper carried worry. Moctezuma did his best to stay calm in front of them. He spoke with steady words. He kept his posture straight, his voice soft. He didn't want to add more fear to the room. But when the advisors left and the palace went quiet again, that's when the loneliness settled in. Moctezuma had always been spiritual. He was used to praying, meditating, looking for signs from the gods. But now his prayers carried a new kind of heaviness, questions he didn't know how to answer. Is this the moment the omens warned me about? What did I do wrong? Is this still the right path for my people? He didn't cry, didn't panic, didn't lose control. He just thought a lot. Meanwhile, the Spanish tried to act normal. They brought gifts, acted respectful, spoke politely, even smiled. But it didn't fix anything. You can't put someone in a quiet prison and then cheerfully say, everything's fine. That's not how human emotions work. Cordes would visit and talk to Moctezuma as if they were two leaders casually discussing weather or harvest seasons. Moctezuma responded with calmness that almost felt unreal. He didn't accuse, didn't complain. He played along because he believed that keeping the peace inside the palace might keep the peace outside the palace too. In the hallways, palace workers moved like shadows. They carried food, cleaned rooms, lit torches, all while trying not to make eye contact with the Spanish soldiers. They were scared, but in a quiet way. The kind of fear where you don't run, you just shrink a little. Outside the palace, regular citizens didn't know the full truth yet. They only sensed that something felt different. They saw fewer royal announcements. They saw fewer nobles entering and leaving the palace. They saw Spanish soldiers looking more serious. So rumors began floating around the city like feathers, light but impossible to catch. Maybe the emperor is sick. Maybe he is thinking too much. Maybe he is resting. No one imagined the real situation, an emperor who could not walk freely in his own home. Back in the palace, Moctezuma spent more time alone. He watched the gardens from behind lattice windows. He listened to the faint sound of music drifting in from distant parts of the city. He watched torches flicker in the courtyard at night. All of it familiar, yet slightly distant now. His world had shrunk without making a sound. He still met with the Spanish diplomats, still greeted his own people. But every meeting had a new layer of awkwardness, like two groups pretending everything was normal while everyone knew it wasn't. Sometimes Spanish soldiers would stand outside his door with spears pointed straight down, not threatening, just symbolic. The message was clear: you're important. Too important to move freely. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people, but still feeling trapped. Moctezuma felt that deeply. He walked from room to room with the slow steps of someone carrying a heavy thought instead of a heavy body. But here's the thing, even in that quiet prison, Moctezuma didn't break. He didn't stop thinking like a ruler. He didn't stop caring about his people. He kept observing. He kept reflecting. He kept hope alive, even though he didn't say it out loud. And that's the sad beauty of this chapter. It's not loud, not dramatic, not chaotic. It's a man trying to stay strong in a cage that doesn't look like a cage made of politeness, fear, confusion, and the slow shifting of power. The palace still sparkled at night. The torches still burned. The lake still shimmered outside the city walls. But for Moctezuma, the world had changed, and the quiet halls of his home and now echoed with something he had never felt before, the soft, steady sound of being watched. Tenochtitlan was still as beautiful as ever, but the vibe was changing. You know, when you walk into a room and everyone suddenly goes quiet and you're like, okay, what exactly is going on? The whole city felt like that. People didn't have all the details yet. Nobody knew exactly what was happening inside the palace or why Moctezuma wasn't walking out through the big gates anymore. But everyone could feel something shifting. And once a city of hundreds of thousands starts sensing something weird, you get a whole lot of nervous energy floating around. At the markets, things looked normal on the surface. The vendors were still there, calling out their goods, showing off bright feathers, clay pots, fruits, tortillas fresh off the griddle. But even with all that color and sounds, the energy had dropped a level. You could see it in how people talked. Instead of loud, cheerful bargaining, folks leaned closer to whisper. Instead of laughing at jokes, they smiled only halfway. Instead of staying out late to enjoy music or watch dancers by torchlight, they packed up early, saying things like, "Let's get home before sunset." Even though nobody could explain why, people didn't know the truth. They just knew something felt off. Rumors floated through the city like dust in sunlight. Nobody started them, but they appeared out of nowhere and spread with super speed. Some whispered that the emperor was resting. Others said he was busy with ceremonies. A few claimed the Spanish had brought strange illnesses. Someone even said Moctezuma had turned into a spirit temporarily to talk to the gods. Rumors are wild like that. The less people know, the more their imagination goes, full creative mode. But the biggest rumor, the one spoken only when people checked behind them first, went something like, maybe the emperor isn't free to move. No one wanted that rumor to be true. In their world, the emperor wasn't just a ruler. He was the center of the universe, the bridge between gods and humans. The idea of him being limited or watched didn't even fit in people's minds. Still, the rumor wouldn't go away. Meanwhile, Spanish soldiers were walking around the city more often. Not aggressively, just present. A little too present. People would be shopping for vegetables and suddenly notice two Spanish men passing by, helmets shining in the daylight. Kids stared at them like they were creatures from stories, poking each other and whispering, look, the shiny ones." Adults watched more carefully. Nobody stepped forward to cause trouble, but they stepped aside more slowly. They kept an eye on the strangers. They didn't smile as much. They just observed. Back near the palace, the tension was even heavier. Priests in white cotton robes walked up the temple stairs holding offerings, but their eyes kept sliding toward the palace walls as if expecting news, any news, to come spilling out. Inside homes, families spoke in low voices at night. They talked about how Moctezuma hadn't given a public speech in days. They wondered when they'd see him standing on the palace balcony again. Mothers hushed their kids, telling them not to repeat anything outside the house because, people are listening. Even the lake seemed quieter, like the water itself was waiting. But the weirdest part, life still kept going. People still worked, still prayed, still cooked dinner, still paddled canoes across the canals. It was normal life, just with the volume turned down and the tension turned up. The nobles felt the mood shift first. They were used to walking straight into the palace to speak with Moctezuma. Now, guards politely delayed them, not rudely, just enough to make them go, "Okay, that's strange." They traded worried glances, left early, and whispered to each other halfway down the steps. High priests noticed too. They felt something in the air. Not magic, not omens, just human fear creeping around corners, settling into people's hearts. Kids sensed it even though nobody told them anything. Kids are always like that. They feel energy before adults admit anything is wrong. They played more quietly, stayed close to home, and avoided the Spanish soldiers because, well, the helmets were kind of intimidating. Meanwhile, inside the palace walls, Spanish guards tried to act normal, which honestly made it look even more suspicious. They stood in straight lines, nodded politely, and kept their faces serious. But everyone could tell something was off, and then there was Moctezuma himself. The emperor was inside his private chambers, trying to keep peace in a storm nobody could see clearly. He still met with messengers, still sent out instructions, still kept the empire running. But the truth that only the closest nobles and palace workers knew was that he wasn't free to leave, even though he wasn't physically harmed or shouted at. The emotional weight was huge. Imagine being the leader of a massive empire and suddenly you can't walk out into your own city, even if you want to. That kind of silence. Yeah, it echoes. News, half-truths, and guesses started spreading faster. People said the emperor was worried. Others said he was protecting them by staying inside. A few even said the Spanish had enchanted him, which honestly was more dramatic than anything happening. Still, nobody had the full story, and that uncertainty made the whole city feel unbalanced. Even nature joined the tension. Birds flying over the palace roof seemed to circle a little longer, like they knew something serious was happening down below. Dogs barked more at night. The usual city sounds, drums, laughter, music, felt thinner. Visitors from nearby towns entered the city and instantly felt the awkwardness. They'd whisper, "Why is everyone so quiet?" And locals would say, "Just keep your voice down." The tension showed up in the marketplace most clearly. Vendors usually fought for the best spots, teasing each other and yelling jokes across the aisles. Now, they just set up their stalls quietly. They weighed goods carefully. They didn't ask the Spanish soldiers to try their food anymore. Customers moved faster, buying what they needed and heading straight home. The city wasn't panicking. It wasn't in chaos. It wasn't in danger. It was just on edge, like a string pulled tight but not snapped. Everyone felt something coming. Nobody knew What? Nobody knew when, but they could sense the air changing, thicker, heavier, waiting. And people whispered the same line over and over. Something is about to happen. They didn't know the details. They didn't know how or why or who, but the city that once felt like the center of the world now felt like a drum with a quiet tremor running through it. Tenochtitlan was still shining, still alive, still proud, but the harmony was fading, and pretty soon those quiet whispers were going to turn into something louder. So the thing about huge historical events is that they rarely begin with some dramatic explosion, thunderstrike, or a dude yelling. This changes everything. Nope, most world-changing moments start kind of quietly, almost like your life casually tripping on a Lego, but pretending it didn't hurt. That's pretty much how things went in Tenochtitlan. Yeah. By this point in the story, the city was still doing its usual thing, markets buzzing, canoes sliding across the lake, priests doing their morning rituals, and messengers running laps like they were training for some ancient Olympics. But underneath all that normal life was a nervous energy, like the feeling you get the night before your exam, even though you've studied, kinda. The calm, that wasn't really calm. Moctezuma had allowed the Spanish into the city, and for a while things looked surprisingly peaceful. People were curious. Kids pointed at the Spanish armor and whispered, "Bro, why do they sound like rattling pots every time they walk?" The Spanish stared back just as confused. They couldn't believe this giant floating city actually existed. But here's the thing peace was hanging on by a thread, a very thin thread. The kind of thread that breaks if someone sneezes too hard. Tensions were rising, even if nobody wanted to admit it. The Aztecs were watching the Spanish like, okay, we're being polite, but what do these guys actually want? And the Spanish were thinking, this place is amazing, but also we totally want this place. Two different goals, two different worldviews, one very awkward room. Enter the spark. Now, the spark wasn't some epic showdown or giant battle. Nope. It started with something way smaller, a festival. Yep, a festival. Leave it to humans to somehow turn a party into a disaster. The festival of Tite-Xcatl was coming up, a big yearly celebration filled with music, dances, and ceremonies dedicated to one of the major gods. The Aztecs were excited. This was their moment to breathe and forget about the weird armored roommates living in their royal palace. The Spanish, however, felt uneasy. Cortés wasn't even in the city at the time. He'd left temporarily, and he had a habit of acting like the world was his personal strategy board game. In his absence, the man he left in charge became worried. He saw the festival preparations and thought, a huge gathering of armed dancers inside a city where we are guests surrounded in a palace with no exit route. Basically, his brain activated paranoia mode. Meanwhile, the Aztec nobles planning the festival were literally thinking about the opposite. Let's make this thing beautiful, smooth, and respectful so nobody freaks out. Two different interpretations. Same event, no shared understanding. A recipe for trouble. The festival begins, and so does the miscommunication. Picture it bright costumes, drums echoing across the plaza, flower petals scattered on stone floors, families gathering, and performers practicing steps they learned since childhood. It was all supposed to be peaceful, sacred, joyful. But to the Spanish commander, it looked like a possible rebellions dressed in fancy outfits. And that's where the spark really happened, in the mismatch between what people meant and what people feared. The Aztecs were doing tradition. The Spanish saw danger. Nobody sat down to ask, hey man, what's actually happening here? You know how sometimes a small misunderstanding with someone grows into something huge because nobody wants to talk first. That's what was happening here, but on an empire level scale. Fear meets pressure. Tenochtitlan was sitting in this weird moment, peaceful on the surface, troubled underneath. Moctezuma felt torn between wanting to protect his people and wanting to avoid a full-on clash with guests who clearly had powerful weapons. His advisors were split too. Some said, keep calm. Others said, yo, they're acting weird. Over at the Spanish camp, the acting commander was freaking out because he believed the Aztecs were hiding weapons under their festival clothes. To him, the dancers weren't dancers. They were potential soldiers in disguise. And once that idea planted itself in his head, it refused to leave. It shows how fear, especially fear built on assumptions, can twist normal things into threats. Two worlds trying and failing to understand each other. Imagine two people speaking different languages, trying to share the same kitchen, and both think the other might secretly be planning something. One reaches for a knife to chop tomatoes. The other sees that and thinks, I'm about to get stabbed. That was Tenochtitlan. Aztecs, we're honoring the gods with music and dance. Spanish, they're preparing to strike. Aztecs, we're welcoming you respectfully. Spanish, they're surrounding us. It wasn't that either side was evil here. It was that they were terrified and had zero clue how to read each other, and fear. Fear is a terrible translator. The moment pressure finally snapped. So the festival went from, yay, celebration, to, wait, why are the Spanish acting so tense? The nobles noticed the weird energy. The musicians felt a shift in the air. Even the kids watching from rooftops suddenly whispered less and stared more. It was like the entire city was holding one long, uncomfortable breath. And then the spark finally hit something dry. The Spanish commander made a decision based on fear, not facts. He and his men stepped into the plaza during the festival. Their armor clanked, their boots thudded, and everyone turned to look. That moment, that quiet, frozen second where nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even breathed. That was the spark. Not the action that followed, not the consequences, but that moment of misunderstanding, fear, and mistrust. The second when two worlds realized they were no longer meeting peacefully, but colliding. Why this spark mattered so much, if you've ever been in a room where the mood suddenly shifts, you know that feeling. Imagine that, but multiplied by thousands. The Aztecs knew something was wrong. Their festival wasn't about rebellion. Their dances weren't a secret attack. They were just doing what they'd always done. But the Spanish didn't know that. And once that spark was lit, it couldn't be put out. It spread from that festival to the palace, to the leaders, to the entire city. One nervous decision created ripples that would turn into waves. And those waves would eventually crash all over Tenochtitlan. This chapter is basically the turning point, the moment when peace officially cracked, even if nobody fully understood how bad it would get yet. And just like that, the story changes. If the early chapters were about curiosity and caution, and the middle chapters were about confusion and mixed signals, then this spark is the shift. The tone changes. The tension becomes real. The maybe becomes definitely. History doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it slips quietly into a festival, stands in the middle of a crowd, and waits for someone to notice. And in Tenochtitlan, someone finally did. If someone had asked the people of Tenochtitlan earlier that day, hey, do you think tonight's going to be special? Most folks would have shrugged and said something like, maybe the weather will be nice. Nobody expected the sky to feel heavier than usual, or the air to hold that weird, tingly feeling. You know, the kind that makes you stop for a second and think, something's up, but I can't explain it. Evening rolled in quietly. The sun dipped behind the mountains, and the lake turned its usual soft orange, then purple, then that deep inky blue that looks like someone spilled paint across the water. Canoes glided home, torches were lit along the causeways, and the city slipped into that calm, dreamy mood that Tenochtitlan did so well. And then came the rain, not a dramatic rainstorm at first, just a gentle, rhythmic tapping. Almost cute, honestly, like the sky was just warming up. People pulled their cloaks a little tighter, looked up, and went, Rain again? Nice and normal. But the clouds, those were not normal. Thick, low, and moving in slow, heavy curls. It felt like the city was being hugged by a giant, sleepy storm cloud, not threatened, just wrapped. The kind of weather where you'd normally sit inside, sip something warm, and listen to the drops hit your roof. Torches glowed along the walkways, their flames shakily dancing every time the wind teased them. Their reflections wobbled on the wet stone and the water below, almost like the torches were trying to swim. Very aesthetic, very peaceful. But inside the city, there was this shared feeling like everyone had quietly agreed that something was about to happen, though nobody knew what. Not fear exactly, just awareness. That prickly sense in the back of your mind that whispers, stay awake tonight. Even the dogs were restless. And you know dogs always know. While the rain settled in, other shadows moved in the night. The Spanish, trying to slip out of the city without drawing attention. They stepped carefully, trying not to splash in puddles, which is honestly impossible, no matter how sneaky you think you are. Whetstone plus metal boots. Yeah, good luck being silent. Meanwhile, families near the causeways noticed shapes shifting under the torchlight. A few people peeked out from their doorways like, anyone else seeing this? A kid playing with a wooden toy probably tugged on his mom's sleeve to say, why are there so many shadows? And she probably just shushed him gently, still watching the street. The rain thickened. The clouds pressed lower. The torches flickered harder. Everything felt like it was holding its breath. And then it happened. Not a single moment, more like a sudden chain reaction of moments blending together. A shuffle of footsteps. A quick shout. A torch dropping. The kind of sounds that spread fast because quiet nights tend to make tiny noises sound dramatic. Someone heard running. Someone else heard splashing. Another person thought they heard metal hitting stone. Rumors zoomed through the streets faster than any runner. Before long, the calm night had turned. Well, not chaotic, but definitely energetic. Doors opened. People whispered from shadows. Torches waved wildly as people hurried along the walkways, their flames bending like they were trying to escape the storm. The reflections on the wet ground looked like little streaks of fire stretching and shrinking, getting pulled around by the wind and rain from higher rooftops. The whole thing looked unreal, like a painting that suddenly came to life. Not with violence, but with motion. So many lights moving at once, scattered across the city like glowing insects caught in a storm. Fireflies, but dramatic. The rain wasn't helping either. Instead of calming things down, it created this weird, shiny glow everywhere. Water on the ground, water on rooftops, water on the lake, all reflecting torchlight in broken lines and shaky patterns. The whole city shimmered like it was made of glass that someone breathed on. And that's why people later said the sky burned. The sky wasn't on fire. The city wasn't on fire, but everything glowed warm, golden, frantic, alive against a dark, heavy sky full of rain. It was the definition of surreal. Some people thought the gods were sending a sign. Others thought the storm was reacting to the mood of the people. A few probably wondered if the world was just having a weird night and needed to lie down. Parents pulled their kids close, not in fear, but in that quiet, protective way, like, stay near me until we know what's going on. Priests watched the sky, trying to read the shape of the clouds, the behavior of the rain. Elders whispered that nights like these were the ones that stayed in stories for generations. And yet, through all the noise and confusion, there was something strangely soft about the atmosphere. The storm wrapped sound in a thick, damp blanket. Shouts didn't echo sharply, they blurred. Footsteps didn't crack, they sloshed softly. Even the torchlight felt muted under the heavy clouds. Everything was intense, but also dreamlike. For the people of Tenochtitlan, this wasn't a night of loss. This wasn't a night of defeat. This was a night of realization, the kind that sinks into your bones without needing to speak. Something had changed. Something big. And the city knew it. But the beautiful part, they didn't panic. They waited. They stayed together in their homes, huddled quietly, listening to the rain, feeling the city breathe through the storm. They looked out windows, stood by doorways, held hands, whispered to each other, and simply waited, because every storm eventually clears, and every long night eventually gives in to morning light. So Tenochtitlan held its breath, held its heartbeat steady, held its spirit quiet but strong, and waited for the sun to rise again. Morning didn't exactly rise over Tenochtitlan the next day. It kind of drifted in, slow and sleepy, like the sky was still trying to recover from the long night. The rain clouds were still hanging around, but lighter now, stretched thin and pale like someone had squeezed all the drama out of them. The city felt tired, not destroyed, not broken. Just tired, the way you feel after staying up way too late because something important happened and your brain refused to sleep. Doors opened quietly. People stepped outside like they were testing the day, making sure it was real. The streets were damp, the air cool, and the whole island city hummed with a low, thoughtful energy. Everyone knew life had changed overnight. You didn't need an announcement. You could feel it in the way people talked softer, moved slower, and held their breaths just a little longer when they looked toward the temples or the palace. Moctezuma was gone. And the empire needed someone to steady the world again. That someone was Cote Mach. Now, if you imagine Cote Mach as some dramatic cape flapping hero who shouted orders every minute, nope, that wasn't him. He walked like a regular person, talked like a regular person, and honestly didn't care about fancy titles. But he had something more important, a calm, steady fire inside him, not the loud kind, the kind that keeps you warm through cold nights. He was young, yeah, but not immature. He had this presence, quiet, but anchored like someone who had already spent a long time thinking about what mattered most. When he stepped forward to take the mantle, he didn't give a huge speech. No, people of Tenochtitlan, hear me moment, no dramatic pause, no sudden thunder in the background, just a soft, simple acceptance, like he was saying, okay, if this is what I need to do for my home, then I'll do it. The city felt it instantly. Even people who didn't know him personally had heard stories, how he cared about the canals, how he listened to elders, how he respected the rituals without making them complicated. He wasn't the strongest warrior or the loudest leader, but he understood the heart of the city better than most. You could almost feel a shift in the air. Still heavy, still uncertain, but steadier, like someone finally put their hand on the shaking table to calm it. Qua Atier, Mach spent his first day, the same way anyone would on a big responsibility day. He walked around the palace, around the courtyards, around rooms that had been buzzing with fear the night before. He didn't rush. He didn't bark orders. He just took everything in the way you take a slow breath before making a tough decision. Advisors followed him, speaking quietly, offering updates, whispering concerns. But Qada Mach didn't let the noise push him around. He listened, nodded, asked simple questions, and kept moving with that same steady pace. Outside, life was slowly restarting. Women swept the wet stone streets. Kids helped their parents carry baskets. Shopkeepers opened stalls even though supplies were thinner than usual. Fishermen checked their nets. Temple attendants lit fresh incense, letting the sweet smoke drift into the cool morning air. And the sound of grinding maize returned, soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. These weren't acts of denial. These were acts of strength. And Qati Mach saw it all. By midday, word had spread through the entire island. We have a leader. We have direction. We're not drifting anymore. And the people didn't cheer wildly or throw a festival. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, they breathed out a little. Just a tiny bit. Enough to ease the tightness in their chests. Qadi Mach gathered some of the city's elders, generals, priests, and artisans, not for a dramatic council, just a calm, honest talk. They sat in a circle, voices gentle, the room smelling like damp earth and incense. They discussed food, water routes, outer villages, the causeways, the lake. There were problems everywhere, big ones, but nobody raised their voice because now solutions felt possible again. At one point, someone asked Qate Mach, "What do you want us to do first?" He didn't give a grand, complicated strategy. He just said quietly, "Let's take care of each other. Everything else will follow." Simple, almost too simple. But it hit everyone in the room with surprising weight. That was the thing about Qate Mach. He didn't try to look clever. He didn't try to look clever. He tried to be human. Throughout the afternoon, people saw him moving across the city. Not riding on something fancy, not guarded by a giant group, just walking, talking to market vendors, checking water channels, helping a family lift a fallen basket stand. A small thing maybe, but it said a lot. Kids stared at him like he was some kind of calm superhero. Old men put a hand on his shoulder as he passed. Women nodded respectfully, not because of his title, but because of the way he carried it. And the weird thing, even with all the fear still floating around the city, there was this spark, tiny but real. Hope. Not loud hope. Not dramatic hope. Just a warm, flickering little feeling that maybe Tenochtitlan still had a chance to stand tall. As the sun began to lower, the clouds finally decided they'd had enough drama for one day. They cracked open, letting slivers of gold fall across the rooftops. The water in the canal lit up like a trail of melted sunlight, and the whole city looked softer somehow, wrapped in a golden glow like a blessing. Quat-e-Mach stood on a balcony for a moment, watching the city breathe under the fading light. He didn't smile big, just a tiny one, the kind you make when something hurts, but you're still ready to fight for it. Behind him, advisors waited. Plans needed making. Messages needed sending. Supplies needed counting. But Quat-e-Mach stayed there a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around him. Because he knew something important. An empire isn't held together by stone or temples or walls. It's held together by people, families, workers, elders, kids, all holding on to each other. And as long as those people kept their hearts steady, the city still had a pulse. When night finally came again, it didn't feel like the night before. It felt calmer, warmer, grounded. Tenochtitlan wasn't safe, not by a long shot, but it wasn't lost either. Not with Quat-e-Mach at the center of it, holding the line with quiet resolve, not with thousands of people lighting small torches in their homes, keeping the city glowing from the inside. A new leader had stepped forward. A new chapter had begun. And even in the middle of fear and pressure, something bright was growing, something strong. Hope didn't run through the streets shouting. It walked. Slow, steady, determined, just like Quat-e-Mach. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a shout or a horn or even a messenger running through the streets. It was silence, not the peaceful morning silence people liked, the kind you get before the market wakes up. This was the other kind, the heavy, suspicious. Why is everything quiet? Kind. Early that morning, a few fishermen headed out in their canoes, expecting the usual calm lake. Instead, they saw strange shapes in the distance. At first, they thought, maybe it's just fog doing weird fog things. But then the fog didn't move, and the shapes didn't go away. Word spread fast. People whispered on balconies, leaned over canals, and pointed like, yo, you seeing this? By noon, everyone knew the Spanish and their allies were surrounding the lake. And just like that, the siege had quietly begun. Water starts acting suspicious. Now, the lifeline of Tenochtitlan wasn't the causeways. It was water. Fresh water came from aqueducts stretching across the lake. These aqueducts were like the city's veins, keeping people alive, filling cups, washing clothes, watering Chinampus. Basically, they were the MVP of the city. So when neighbors started complaining that water was arriving slower, looking kind of sad, and tasting like disappointment, people got nervous. Mothers stood over clay pots, frowning Kids poked the water like, why does it taste like it has trust issues? Priests tested it and whispered things like, this is not a great sign at all. Everyone tried to act chill, but the truth was simple. The aqueducts were being messed with, and the city felt the pressure immediately. Tenochtitlan usually had markets bursting with energy, bright, chilly smells, steam from tamal pots, sellers yelling over each other like it was a sport. It was chaotic in a fun way. But during the siege, the vibe changed. The market still opened, but it felt tired. The piles of corn were smaller. The fruit bowls looked like someone had already picked through the best stuff. And the prices? They climbed faster than gossip in a school hallway. People bought only what they needed. Some bought less than that. Families started stretching meals, a little more water in the stew, a little less spice, a little more patience. It wasn't a disaster yet, just that uneasy middle phase where you're trying to convince yourself everything is okay, even though your stomach is like, bro, I know what's up. But the city still had heart. Here's the thing about Tenochtitlan. Yes, it was huge, complex, powerful, but more than anything, it was connected. When things got tough, people didn't just sulk at home. They leaned on each other. Neighbors shared food. Old ladies handed out tortillas to kids with the "I insist" face. Chinampa farmers took smaller harvests and still divided them among families in their district. Fishermen risked getting way too close to enemies just to bring back a few baskets of fish. The city wasn't just surviving, it was carrying its way through the struggle. It wasn't loud, flashy heroism. It was the quiet kind. The "we're in this together" kind. The kind that actually keeps people going. Inside the palace, a storm with no rain, while the rest of the city worked, shared, cooked, and whispered, the palace carried a different vibe. A heavier one. Cuauhtémoc held meetings that felt more like therapy sessions than military planning sometimes. Each advisor brought a new problem. The Western Causeway is blocked. The allies are growing in number. The water supply is drying up Tao. The people are scared, but hiding it. Cuauhtémoc listened to everything, calm, serious, determined. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But every time he spoke, he anchored the room. His message was simple. We'll resist. We'll endure. We'll stand as one. Even the older generals who had seen enough battles to develop permanent frowns relaxed a bit when he talked. People didn't follow Cuauhtémoc because he was emperor. They followed him because he cared, really cared, about the city. Nights filled with echoes. When the sun went down, the city didn't sleep peacefully anymore. Some nights you could hear drums far away, not the festive kind, the "someone out there is planning something" kind. Other nights, the water carried faint splashes, canoes moving, shadows crossing the lake. People leaned out of their homes, squinting like, is that a friend or a problem? Sometimes the Spanish lit torches on the distant shores, long lines of light flickering through the mist. Tenochtitlan felt like it was on stage, surrounded by watching eyes. Even the birds got weird. They flew in confused circles, maybe thinking, okay, what are humans doing now? The whole city felt trapped between dread and determination, a new kind of daily life. Life didn't stop, it just reshaped itself. School lessons were shorter. Temple rituals included prayers asking for strength, unity, and calmer days. Craftsmen still carved stone and shaped gold, but now they worked in small groups, more quietly, sharing materials and stories. Kids played less near canals and more in courtyards. They turned everything into a game, even pretending to be defenders of the city, complete with wooden shields and dramatic sound effects. And even though the grown-ups were stressed, they still paused to smile at the kids' silly poses. Humor didn't disappear. People still joked. Water's back. Oh, wait. That's just the rain cheating. If corn gets any more expensive, we'll start using it like jewelry. Those laughs weren't pointless. They were survival tools, messages from across the lake. Every once in a while, someone managed to sneak through the blockade, a brave runner, a swimmer, a canoe slipping through shadows. They brought news, warnings, and sometimes encouragement. People outside the city still believe in you. Supplies are being gathered. Stay strong. Even a few short words lifted spirits like a gust of cool wind. The siege tightens its grip. By the end of the second week, no one pretended things were normal anymore. Water rationing became official. Food lines grew longer. People slept lightly, waking up at the slightest sound. But along with fear, something else grew too: resolve. The kind of quiet bravery that doesn't brag. The kind that doesn't need speeches or banners. The kind that lives in everyday actions. Families prepared for whatever came next. Priests prayed longer. Warriors polished their shields. Mothers told their kids, "We've faced hard days before. We'll face this too." Tenochtitlan wasn't collapsing. It was bracing, steadying itself, breathing slow, even when the air felt thin, and yet hope stayed. Even surrounded, even pressured, even exhausted, the city held on to a spark. Every sunset painted the lake gold. Every morning, the Chinampas still glowed with green. Every night, small torches flickered like stars, refusing to go out. People looked at their home, the canals, the temples, the gardens, and reminded themselves, we're still here. Because the siege wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a test of heart. And Tenochtitlan, even under the tight grip of the enemy, kept showing the world exactly how strong a heart could be. Morning arrived slowly, like even the sun was hesitating. It peeked over the mountains with this soft, tired glow, not the usual bright, confident shine Tenochtitlan was used to. The light drifted across the lake, catching the tops of temples, the tips of Chinampa plants, the quiet rooftops where people had slept little, if at all. It didn't look like the start of a normal day. It looked like the city itself was whispering, this might be our last calm morning. But instead of panic, instead of chaos, the city moved gently, carefully, almost respectfully, like everyone secretly agreed to treat the day with a kind of softness. The city wakes one last time. Vendors still open their stalls, though their baskets were mostly empty. They sat with folded hands, greeting neighbors with nods instead of jokes. The air held that strange mix of sadness and acceptance, like the whole city understood something huge was coming. Kids peeked out from doorways, feeling the weird quiet. Some still played with little clay toys, but even their games seemed slower, less noisy. On the canals, a few canoes drifted lazily, not to fish, just to move, to breathe, to take in their home while they still could. The water reflected everything. The pale sunrise, the shadows of the temples, and the faces of people who had grown up in this bright, floating city. Everyone was holding on to their favorite views, their favorite sounds, their favorite memories, as if storing them for later, just in case. Inside homes, little moments that hit hard, families gathered close, eating small breakfasts that felt more symbolic than filling. A mother brushed her son's hair even though he didn't need it. A grandmother laid her hands on a clay pot her own mother had given her. Two brothers shared a blanket even though it wasn't cold. Tiny, quiet moments like these filled the morning. Moments that weren't dramatic or loud, but carried all the feelings in the world. One old man sat near his window, watching the sun hit the temple walls, whispering. I always thought I'd see this view forever, not in a sad way, more like someone cherishing a last chapter of a book they loved. Priests and temples, a last gift of peace. Up at the temples, priests performed rituals as calmly as they could. Nothing extreme, just prayers, songs, incense. The smoke lifted into the air, slow and steady, curling into the pale sky. It smelled warm and familiar, like comfort. People walking nearby stopped to close their eyes and breathe it in. A lot of them grew up with that smell. They knew it as well as they knew their own heartbeat. One priest, his robe worn and faded, whispered to a young apprentice, "We cannot control the ending, but we can choose the spirit we face it with." The apprentice nodded, eyes shining, trying to be brave. All around the temples, people gathered quietly, not to witness anything dramatic, but just to be there, to stand together, to hold the last peaceful daylight with both hands. Kwatemok, a leader in shadows and light. In the palace, Kwatemok stood by a balcony, watching the city below. He looked exhausted, yes, but also grounded, like a young tree that refused to break even in a storm. He saw the quiet markets, the drifting canoes, the small clusters of families holding hands. All these scenes settled into him like heavy stones he carried without complaint. Advisors approached him with reports. Supplies are nearly gone. The causeways are surrounded. The people, they're anxious, but still holding on. Kwatemok nodded gently to each one. He didn't make a grand speech. He didn't try to hide his emotions. He just said, "Today, let everyone be with their families. We will face what comes after the sun." That was it. Simple. Human. Exactly the kind of leader he was. Some of the older generals wiped their eyes when he turned away. They would never admit it out loud, of course, but they knew they were witnessing something rare, a leader whose heart was breaking for his people, not for his power. A walk through the city everyone knows. By midday, the light grew stronger, but instead of warming the city, it felt like a spotlight. People walked slowly through streets they'd known their whole lives. They touched the walls, the canal-side stones, the edges of market stalls. Some even dipped their fingers into the lake water one last time, letting the cool ripples slide across their skin. A group of teens climbed onto a rooftop and just sat there, legs dangling, looking out at the whole city like they wanted to memorize it. One of them whispered, "Do you think people in the future will even know this place existed?" Another laughed softly. "They better. We're literally sitting on an island city. It's too cool to forget." And even in that moment, on the edge of something historic and terrifying, they smiled because Even though fear sat heavy on everyone's shoulders, the love for the city sat heavier. Whispers of what might come. No one talked directly about defeat. Not really. But hints were everywhere. Mothers told stories to calm their kids. Fathers repaired tools quietly. Elders told young ones where the family treasures were hidden. A few people gathered near the temples and whispered prayers. Let the city be remembered. Let our stories live. Let our children grow strong. Nobody cried loudly. No big emotional breakdowns. Just quiet eyes, tight breaths, hands held a little too long. The kind of sadness that sits deep inside and doesn't need words. The last meal before the unknown. As the sun began to lower, families prepared one more shared meal, small plates, simple food, but made with care. People sat close, talked softly, smiled when they could. Someone in one house tried to make a joke. Well, at least we don't have to argue about what to cook tomorrow. The family laughed, not because it was that funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only thing standing between you and fear. Across the city, you could hear faint music, flutes, drums, voices humming old songs. Not celebration music, memory music. Songs that reminded people who they were. The sun slips away. As evening approached, the sky turned golden, so bright it made the lake look like liquid fire. Tenochtitlan glowed in that light like it wanted to show off its beauty one last time. People stood by the canals, rooftops, and balconies, watching the sunset settle over their home. Even warriors paused to take it in. The whole city looked like it was holding its breath. And when the sun finally dipped below the mountains, it felt like a chapter closing itself, gently, respectfully, lovingly. No wailing, no collapse, just acceptance. A soft, brave letting go. But not the end, even in the fading light, even in the quiet fear, even at the edge of the empire's final day, something warm stayed alive. Hope. Not the wild, loud kind, the steady kind, the kind that says, our land will survive, our stories will survive, our spirit will survive. The daylight faded, but the heart of Tenochtitlan, it still burned. When the dust finally settled and the days stopped feeling like one long storm, the first thing people noticed wasn't the ruins. It was the silence. Not an empty silence, more like the silence after a long cry, when your breathing finally slows and your mind tries to understand what just happened. Tenochtitlan had changed forever, but the people living on its broken streets weren't just survivors. They were carriers of something ancient, something bigger than stone walls or causeways or temples. They carried a whole world inside them, and that world didn't end. The city may have fallen, but the people didn't for a while. Life felt like walking through a dream that didn't match what your heart remembered. The bright marketplaces were gone. The great temples no longer echoed with songs. The canals looked different, quieter, almost shy. But the people, the families who had lived through it all, they didn't disappear. They gathered in small clusters, shared food, shared memories, shared whatever strength they had left, and slowly, little by little, life began to rebuild itself. A grandmother taught her granddaughter how to grind maize on a stone. A father carved a small flute for his son. A young woman braided her sister's hair using the same patterns their mother taught them. Each tiny action was basically the same message, whispered again and again. were still here. Traditions travel better than stone. Even though the temples were damaged, the traditions didn't stay trapped inside them. They slipped out and lived on in kitchens, in songs, in stories told at night around small fires. People kept telling the old stories about gods made of sunshine, heroes with brave hearts, and worlds born from sacred battles. These stories didn't vanish. They wrapped around families like warm blankets. Moms told bedtime tales about Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, bringing knowledge to humans. Fathers explained the old calendar, tracing symbols in the dirt with their fingers. Kids giggled at the funny myths, the ones where gods acted more like chaotic cousins than divine beings. It didn't matter that the world around them had changed. Their stories kept growing wings. The language that refused to fade, Nahuatl, the Aztec language, didn't disappear either. People kept speaking it at home, at markets, during celebrations. It was too woven into their breath to let go. There was something musical about it, something soft but strong, like a river that can change direction but never stops flowing. Even centuries later, Nahuatl is still alive, still spoken, still shaping the way people think, feel, and describe their world. Words like chocolate, tomato, coyote, and avocado actually come from Nahuatl. So every time someone anywhere on Earth says, tomato, the Aztecs whisper, yep, that's one of ours. Kind of a flex, honestly. Art that glowed through the years, Aztec art didn't crumble with the temples. It slipped into pottery, clothing patterns, jewelry, and carvings. People didn't need giant stone walls to express beauty. They painted designs on fabrics, shaped tiny figures out of clay, wove bright colors into blankets, and carved little symbols into wooden spoons and bowls. Every swirl, every color, every symbol meant something, usually courage, time, or belonging. Art became one of the main ways the culture survived when everything else felt uncertain. Even in the hardest days, people kept creating things that reminded them who they were. If you think about it, that might be one of the strongest kinds of resistance. Stories that hid in hearts and came back stronger as years passed. Some traditions had to hide a bit. People practiced them quietly, carefully, like protecting a tiny fire from the wind. But even hiding didn't weaken them. It made them sharper, more meaningful. Songs were sung in softer voices, but they still carried the same spirit. Ceremonies continued in smaller spaces, but they still held the same respect. Names of gods were whispered instead of shouted, but they still lived on. Generations carried these things from parent to child, like passing down a precious necklace made of memories. And eventually, when the world changed again and people were free to express themselves, those traditions stepped back into the sunlight. Older, wiser, and still glowing. Identity that refused to give up even after everything. Aztec identity didn't dissolve. People didn't wake up one morning and say, welp, we're someone else now. No, they were still Nahua, still children of the valley, still part of a culture built on thousands of years of history. Their identity lived in their food, their language, their stories, their music, their calendars, their connection to the land. Even their sense of humor survived. That slightly sarcastic, life is wild, but we deal with it type attitude. Honestly, you can still feel that vibe in Mexico today. Cities fall. People rise Tenochtitlan became Mexico City, a massive place full of life, noise, food smells, traffic, and history tucked into every corner. If you walk through it today, you can still see pieces of the Aztec world beneath your feet. Old stones, old foundations, old pathways hiding under modern streets. You can stand in the middle of the city and literally feel time layered around you like a giant historical sandwich. And the coolest part, people who identify with that heritage still live there, still celebrate their ancestors, still speak the old words, still honor the old gods in different ways. The culture didn't vanish. It shapeshifted, survived in new forms. It did what all strong cultures do. It adapted without losing its soul, the spirit that never left. Even after the empire fell, one thing stayed untouched: the spirit of the Aztec world, the spirit of courage, the spirit of creativity, the spirit of community, the spirit of believing the world is bigger than anything we can see. You can feel it in modern festivals, in artwork, in dances, in family traditions, in the way people tell stories with their hands and their hearts. It's in the bright colors, the laughter, the stubborn hope, the pride that refuses to dim. The spirit kept walking forward generation after generation until it reached today, alive, breathing, confident, and very much present. Not an ending, a transformation. If you look at the fall of Tenochtitlan as a full stop, the story feels sad. But if you look at it as a turning point, the whole thing becomes something else entirely. The empire ended, but the people, they kept going. Their memories kept going. Their traditions kept going. Their identity kept going. The story didn't end. It transformed, just like the city rose from the lake. The culture rose from the ashes. And now, when someone looks back at that time, they don't just see loss. They see strength. They see resilience. They see a civilization that refused to let history erase it. And honestly, that's the most beautiful ending a story could have.